Welcome to MSD at Home. I might make a slow start. My name is Hélène FRICHOT. I'm Professor of Architecture and Philosophy and Director of the Bachelor of Design at the MSD in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning here. Welcome to the MSD at Home, where we enjoy introducing you to critical thinkers for architecture and design and creative practitioners keen to make the world a better place. I want to commence by paying my respects to the original custodians of the lands on which we live and work. For me, this means acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation who have cared for this land, which was never ceded, for thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be online today. And this evening, I'm really pleased to introduce Associate Professor Daniel BARBER, who is chair of the PhD program in architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, but in fact currently sitting in Portugal. His research and teaching narrate eco-critical histories of architecture and seek pathways into the post-carbon future. He is a research fellow at the Käte Hamburger Centre for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies at Universität Heidelberg. And he edits the really wonderful accumulation series on e-flux, on the e-flux online journal, and is co-founder of Current, the collective on environment and architectural history. His most recent book is Modern Architecture and Climate, Design Before Air Conditioning, out with Princeton Press just last year. And recently he's also published an article, Active Passive, Heat Storage and the Solar Imaginary, which recently appeared in the South Atlantic Quarterly. And I know that within the MSD, many of our master's students and PhD students have recently been reading his introduction to the special issue of the Journal of Architecture dedicated to architectural history in the Anthropocene. And today he's going to talk to us about thermal barriers, I believe, but he's going to give us a wonderful architectural historical slant on this. So welcome, Daniel. I'll hand things over to you.
Great, thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here remotely. I've spent just far too little time in Melbourne, but it's nice to feel it a little bit from afar. I'm really happy for the invitation. I'm going to go ahead and do the little slide share dance here for a second, and then proceed from there. There we go. I assume you can see everything well enough. So I want to do a few things today. I wanted to help us to kind of think about collectively, right, and think about the ways that architecture is undergoing some transformations and reimagining itself as we face the challenges really of three pandemics. I won't be focusing on all three of them, but the sort of three kind of public health emergencies, if you will. The one that has persisted of white supremacy, the other that is growing stronger of climate change, and then the sort of episodic one that we're still, of course, dealing with today, the viral pandemic of COVID-19. I'm going to talk quite generally. I'm going to, in fact, kind of go a bunch of different places, and that's in part just because that's sort of how I think, but also because the sort of issues and problems and questions that I want to put on the table are multi-layered and have many different dimensions, and so force us to kind of think across a number of familiar boundaries. I want to begin by sort of framing this in relationship to an intersection, a sort of disciplinary intersection within the university context, thinking about the relationship between architecture and the environmental humanities, right? And the environmental humanities is a set of ways of thinking, of research methods, of modes of teaching that has emerged over the past decade or so, and has had a lot of kind of different iterations. And just to to begin to give us a kind of sense of it, you know, these are a handful of many possible slides, just to sort of connect us across the waters here. On the one hand, the emergence of a profound interest in multi-species studies. In many of the most important scholars in that regard operating in the Australian context. And so that's sort of one version of environmental humanities, right? Just kind of thinking about how non-human actors and agents form our worlds, right? And again, I'm not going to talk about that at any great length, just sort of trying to give this larger context. The other half of this slide, which you can, I fear the text gets a little buried there, but the other half of this slide is really a version of the environmental humanities that starts to think about public engagement, right? And this is a project called Beyond the Lab that has to do with bringing students into an area of Philadelphia from where I normally teach at the University of Pennsylvania that involves rethinking the relationship between communities and the oil refineries that make up a big chunk of southeastern Philadelphia. So again, just sort of ways of reimagining our relationship to the non-human world, right? Be that based on other sort of animal species or other sorts of agents and forces in the world that contain and control and manage us. So one of the things to say about this intersection of architecture and the environmental humanities is that in some sort of funny ways, it's something that architects, and certainly landscape architects and sort of creative practitioners in the spatial fields have been concerned with for some time, right? And I think there's a narrative here that says that, that makes it kind of hard to distinguish, let's say, between what we would properly refer to as design research or architectural forms of investigation and this sort of broader construct of the environmental humanities. There's some sort of overlap in the Venn diagram there that's quite profound. This is maybe work that some of you know, Kate Orff and Kate Orff in general, but this specific project of her with Richard Misrach, Petrochemical America, sort of atlas of the so-called Cancer Alley, right, of the area around the Gulf Coast in the US that has been sort of consumed by the petrochemical industry. Mapping and notating and photographing and understanding the spatial and geographic and territorial dimensions, certainly the built environment dimensions, and using then imagery, right? Using diagrams and other forms of media artifacts and notations as a means to understand these complexities, right? So this is, of course, a very different version, a sort of diagram of the embodied energy that makes up many of our buildings and sites, from a great book by David Benjamin, that's drawn by Lindsay Wickstrom, showing the sort of material story of steel, right? So these are sort of environmental humanities adjacent, but again, trying to kind of map this broader set of intersections and interconnections that allow us to begin to recognize a new sort of interdiscursive, intersectional, multifaceted realm for research that takes on a different set of projects, takes on a different set of methods, and does so with a different set of intentions. I don't want to belabor the rest of these. I thought to kind of provide, and I can be happy to provide at the end a sort of list of links, although most of them you can just Google, for example, Feral Atlas, this amazing project by Anand Singh, and then the recent exhibition at the ZKM, Critical Zones, a number of different research projects, public projects, web-based projects, exhibition projects, that again are sort of blurring those boundaries between scholarship and public engagement, between the sciences and the humanities, and many other sort of important boundaries. I'll just again note quickly that one of my own kind of interventions here at the University of Pennsylvania, we have a program on the Penn Program on the Environmental Humanities, as we call it, PPEH. And I was, for the last academic year, the topic director, where we focused on questions of transformation. And so again, to begin to map and model and kind of think about how notions of architectural research are transforming in this context, I organized a number of discussions. This is just one sort of series of panels of about 5 or 6 other events that started to think about the kind of fate of solar energy over the last half century. We'll in effect return to that in a few moments. But in particular, I point you to this film that we screened called A Road Not Taken by Christina Hemmauer and Roman Keller, Swiss artists, who sort of traced the fate of a set of solar panels, not these solar panels that we're seeing here, but traced the trajectory of a set of solar panels that were initially mounted by President Jimmy Carter in the 1970s on the White House in the United States, and then demounted when Ronald Reagan took over the presidency, right? So this kind of notion of what happened to those panels and how to find them and what to do with them, how to exhibit them, how to give them some cultural weight, right? So tracing these histories, understanding their cultural resonance, right, putting them in the context of other sorts of discussions. You know, we also had in the second panel, we talked about both sort of the struggles of solar panel installers, right, and the kind of community and neighborhood challenges they face, and also a number of artists that use solar energy or kind of think through solar energy in their research and in their work. So, you know, we're getting soon to a set of stories, a kind of version of architectural history that plays out some of these questions and some of these themes and starts to bring in this other context and emphasize this set of questions about the environment. But I wanted to first kind of at least give some hint of a sort of broader set of kind of data points of places one can examine this set of interconnections and intersections. So the main thing that environmental humanities does for me, and that distinguishes it from, let's say, environmental histories or architectural histories, and opens up new sort of points of operation, is to allow us to reconsider and refocus our research methods, right? So this is in many ways still very much in process in my own work, to think about how I've been framing it, a sort of interrelationship between quantitative and qualitative knowledge, but I also think of as sort of data and desire, right? And how we begin to negotiate and reimagine our project as designers, as architects, as agents in the built environment on these terms. I'm not going to talk in great detail about some of these slides I'm going to flip through, but just to sort of begin to give you a sense that one of the aspects of my research that has played this out has not been so much using quantitative knowledge, which is to say thermal accounting or energy accounting in BTU terms, right, and barrels of oil that are required to play out, say, a given sort of built environment condition, although we'll see kind of pieces of that, still sort of nascent in my own research. But in many ways, part of my project, my historical project, has been to sort of map and record and excavate from the archives a quite broad range of practices that have very explicitly taken on the project of integrating scientific knowledge, in many cases scientific knowledge about climate, into design practice, right? So quite explicitly trying to sort of merge or see past some of the challenges of various ideological or formal constructs of the field, and to sort of imagine a state of architectural knowledge that really plays out its multiple relationships, its relational condition, right, spreading out to the sciences, the natural and social sciences, into the arts and kind of spaces of experience, right? So again, this is very much something architects do all the time, right? Not only, that's to say, kind of integrate different forms of knowledge, and present them to clients, present them to students, present them to each other, right? But also very much so produce media artifacts, right? And another set of drawings that helps us to kind of think this through, produce images, right? That allow for us to kind of imagine and reimagine the terms of the built environment, specifically, I think, relative to its relationship to the natural world outside, right? So part of what I'm trying to start to focus on, and you know, we'll get into some of these details in just a moment, but trying to begin to map or sort of model a different sense of architecture that the environmental humanities helps us to open up towards, one that again is less about its sort of legacies of formalism or debates around, you know, postmodernism and neo-postmodernism, for example, and instead helps us to really think about architecture as a set of energetic systems, right? Think about architecture as a set of climatic devices, as really adaptive systems that help us to reimagine the way that we're living in the built world. And just to one more kind of flag, one more kind of reach out into the rest of the scholarly world before kind of barreling forward, right? The sort of prospect for a more fundamental rethinking of the history of architecture that draws on these complications of quantitative and qualitative knowledge, right? That starts to produce different narratives and sees different buildings as significant. Just to flag for those of you that might be interested, this is not something I'm directly involved in, but we'll be watching myself a nice kind of moment, I think, in our field, where the Society of Architectural History of Great Britain is organizing a conference next month around the sort of premise of architectural history and the climate emergency, right? And how do we kind of manage negotiate and mediate and think through these two things simultaneously. Okay, so trying to put a number of issues on the table, I want to zero into a few kind of episodes that help us to maybe think more fruitfully about these renewed, renovated, revised architectural histories, allow us to kind of think through them on different terms. And the reason I begin by sort of framing this relative to this question of the environmental humanities is in part to insist that some of that reframing, or an important kind of instigation for that reframing, occurs through an elaboration, a set of interactions and engagements with other fields of knowledge, other discourses, some of them quite familiar to us, right? Some of them perhaps a bit less so. So I want to spend the next sort of minute drawing on one specific set of discourses, which has to do with a set of what's referred to as a sort of petrocultural form of knowledge, right? And petro, of course, being oil, and then the kind of premise being that 20th century culture in particular emerges out of relationships to oil, right? Emerges out of a complex set of relationships to resources. And I'm drawing here on some of the work in the literary fields that has also kind of connected to the environmental humanities, and, you know, happy to elaborate in discussion about the sort of genealogy, if you will, of EH, as I'll occasionally refer to the environmental humanities as, right? The genealogy of it that has a lot to do with elaborations in literary contexts. But one of the kind of important interventions that was made here, and the reason we're looking at this slide, is through the work of Patricia Jaeger, a petrocultural literary theorist, let's call her, who has kind of asked the question of, you know, how do we see oil in literary texts, right? And Jennifer Wenzel has also done amazing work in this regard, and a number of others, how to sort of read for oil, right? And I'm doing this very explicitly in order to help us question, as kind of architectural thinkers, architecture historians, and theorists and practitioners, how do we sort of see oil in our own field? And of course, we'll be getting to that momentarily. But Patricia Jaeger, you know, gives us a very nice sort of example here, and thinking about the book On the Road, written by Jack Kerouac right after World War II, a book perhaps familiar, at least maybe a number of you have heard of it, one of the kind of ultimate novels of the Beat era, right? And that has all sorts of complications in terms of being sort of wildly masculinist, right, and settler colonialist, and many other things. But oddly, and what Jaeger is interested in pointing out, is that besides the fact that the novel is based on this kind of driving across the country of the United States, back from the New York area to California and back, oil is scarcely mentioned, right? The kind of foundation of this narrative is scarcely mentioned. As she writes, recalling one poignant scene, and I quote, "Are the gas stations empty pumps, which were encountered in one scene outside of Chicago when there's kind of no gas available, right? Are the gas stations empty pumps a premonitory metaphor for resource anxiety, an absence around which a real complexity is knit? Kerouac's characters," she continues, "are gasaholics. Oil dependency created their world. Each city, suburb, truck stop, each bit of pie depends on Standard Oil, Shell, Mobil Gas, or Phillips 66, end quote. So again, just kind of focusing on this kind of immense presence and kind of the ways in which this sort of cultural elaboration is really soaked in a condition of oil profligacy, but it's nonetheless invisible in the narrative itself. Now, Kerouac's novel might be sort of an extreme example in that the narrative relies very heavily on the processing of energy for automobile locomotion, but it suggests these sort of broader prospects of petroculture, right? Other critics have emphasized the extent to which this kind of absence of oil in our cultural narratives reflects more general patterns. Graham McDonald, another sort of petrocultural theorist, writes as follows, and I'm quoting, "A strongly developed strain of petrocultural theory focuses on the way in which the means and effects of oil are structurally occluded from its mass of consumers," right? Making it less apparent, still quoting, "making it less apparent as an explicit object in social life, and thus as a specific topic for capitalist production." So we're starting to see that not only is sort of oil absent, right, but it's kind of hidden, right? It's kind of cached away. It's kind of covered over, right? It's kind of made to be difficult to see. MacDonald writes a bit later in this same text, "Oil produces the most violent logic of all energy forms, and in so doing, militates against alternative imaginative forms of representation. Part of the point in theorizing energy as cultural, MacDonald continues, and this is kind of my own leitmotif here, is to expose and determine reasons for our acculturation to its hierarchy of material and immaterial forms, right? So this notion that oil has been sort of made absent by many of our cultural practices, and part of our job as historians and theorists is to sort of bring it back, right? Kind of reveal it, render it visible, make it evident in our practice. Much of this petrocultural theory revolves to some extent around the work of Amitav Ghosh. Another sort of link one could kind of virtually put in the chat here, Amitav Ghosh's recent text, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. It's now 4 or 5 years old, perhaps familiar to some of you, based on a number of lectures actually that are on YouTube and sort of eminently accessible, worth listening to. Ghosh's text identifies the invisibility of oil, as a primary obstacle to cultural engagement with climatic instability, right? And his premise is that the sort of narrative absence of energy is part of this broader, sort of more general cultural condition, the great derangement that is the basis of his title, in which the drivers and consequences of climate change are difficult to integrate not only into historical narratives, right, but also to our sort of cultural logics, right, kind of thinking about causes and effects in our history and future. We've become quite accustomed, if not in fact a little deranged, in sort of keeping energy on the outside of those narratives, right? Ghosh points directly at discursive practices that don't simply ignore oil or climate, right, but in fact operate to hide them, as he writes, and I'm quoting, "In the substantially altered world of the near future, when readers and museum goers turn to the art and literature of our present, will they not look for traces and portents of the altered world of their inheritance? And when they fail to find them," he continues, "what can they do other than conclude that our time was one when most forms of art and literature were drawn into modes of concealment that prevented people from recognizing the realities of their plight?" So it's a bit maybe overstated in the context, and somewhat more delicate context of our own kind of interests perhaps in architecture, but to recognize that much of our cultural discourse, our historical discourse, again, has not only served to manage to not mention energy, despite its incredible relevance to our field, but has even operated by virtue of doing so, and by virtue of many different kind of historiographic patterns that I'd be happy to elaborate on, and we'll see some pieces of, has managed even to hide it, right? To kind of conceal this question of energy as an important force in our cultural life. Ghosh, it's worth noting, makes a couple of references to architecture. The one that I'm kind of alluding to here in these slides, as he writes as follows, if contemporary trends in architecture, such as the super tall pencil towers in New York City that some of you may have heard about, you know, kind of one of the latest things, if you will, in the development architecture world. If contemporary trends in architecture, even in this period of accelerating carbon emissions, favor shiny glass and metal plated towers, do we not have to ask, what are the patterns of desire that are fed by these gestures, right? So again, how are we kind of imagining and aspiring to a different way of life? How do our architectural logics and the narratives that inform them complicate, right, some of those aspirations, and in fact often work quite literally directly against them? Okay, so this kind of broad, you know, wide-ranging initial kind of encounter with the environmental humanities, with petroculture, I think helps us to do a couple of things, right? I mean, first, we see that however kind of sublimated, occluded, and concealed, oil has had a determinant, if not precisely over-determining presence in the cultural development of the late 20th century. It's very difficult to delaminate cultural discourse from the rendering visible of oil. Recent culture in this nuanced sense is petroculture, both reliant on it and resistant to its visibility. Now, all culture in this sense, right, or certainly much of it, is infused with petroleum, and we'll see some exceptions. That's part of what we're getting to, of course. Second, this same cultural ubiquity operates politically, right? And I think it's important to keep in mind in different ways across different parts of the world, and of course in very specific ways in the Australian context, the oil, carbon, coal, different forms of hydrocarbon fuels are themselves a form of violence, right? In terms of their conditions of extraction, their detrimental effects on ecosystems, and as a function and an index and indeed intensifier of economic inequity, right? So to recognize that by occluding oil, by concealing oil, right, we're in fact producing, or at least encouraging certain forms of violence. And finally, third, that in this simultaneous ubiquity and invisibility, oil positions architecture as a mediating mechanism, right? Both a kind of legacy of the habits of the past, and also perhaps an opening out into a different possible future. So one of the things that this petroculture discourse also does for us is kind of asks a set of questions, right? And in Patricia Yeager's article on the Road that I was referring to before, she asked the kind of simple question of what happens if we sort texts according to the energy histories that made them possible, right? And I want to kind of ask a similar question, right? What happens if we start to think about architecture according to the energy histories that has kind of given it life, right? And kind of made it what it is. And one of the things we notice initially, and I realize the text gets pretty small down here, right? But this sort of general, very overall map of the so-called Great Acceleration, right? The kind of consumer expansion of the post-war period. This is 1950 right here. So, the sort of boom that's still booming, right? Of everything from nuclear energy to chewing gum, right? I mean, just kind of more and more stuff everywhere we turn. What are the kind of consequences of this for recognizing that this is also this period immediately post-World War II, the Cold War period, and the various dynamics that it encouraged in terms of energy and architectural elaborations. This is also the period of a certain type of elaboration of modern architecture, right? And we begin to sort of map and model these different contexts and begin to rethink how we can sort of think about the history of 20th century architecture according to these very specific sets of energy reliances, energy dependences, and energy systems. So before diving in a little bit more precisely to a number of stories, I'm going to begin to just kind of, flood our eyes with some images and some buildings, some of which we know and some of which are less familiar, to help kind of send home, I hope, two sort of precepts that I hope we've begun to arrive at this point, right? I mean, again, thinking about this broad construct of the environmental humanities, this kind of, say, thinner strand of petrocultural criticism, and then how we sort of place architecture within that, right? And part of the argument that I'm trying to make here, trying to tease out, or really not so much an argument as a recognition, that in this broad context of a set of discourses and literary and cultural and historical forms of research that are thinking about the environment in new and dynamic ways, in this context, architecture plays something of a special, has a kind of a special role, right? Because it's both quite literally an agent in those discourses as a kind of aspect of that energy system and of that environmental condition, at the same time that we're reflecting on its historical parameters. I hope this dog barking isn't coming in too loudly. Okay, so we kind of end up with two sort of precepts that help us to frame this relationship. The first that I'll claim is that all architecture is environmental, right? All buildings are evidence of a social relationship to environmental systems, to ecological conditions, not necessarily a good relationship, right? And of course, some of those towers we just saw represent a quite, again, violent and destructive relationship to ecosystems. But all the same, all architecture performs an environment, right? Is kind of engaged with these sets of questions. And the second sort of precept that becomes to the fore is the recognition that all buildings are energetic systems, right? As much as they are homes, offices, or schools, buildings manage social relationships to fuel resources, and the embodied energy of their materials and their use of specific fuels for heating and cooling, and so on and so forth. They not only sort of produce a certain type of energetic condition by virtue of the heating and cooling in the interior, but they in fact produce a sort of thermal life, right? A set of thermal practices as we're sort of slowly working up to. Okay, so a few examples that will start to get us into some specifics and help us to indeed kind of run through to some conclusions as well, that help us to kind of think about how the world has been formed, how our architectural world in particular has been formed by these conditions of fuel. We can look, for example, at this building, the Bauhaus Dessau, a building that I expect many of you are quite familiar with, which we can begin to understand both for its kind of elaboration of a certain type of cultural opening, right? Famed, of course, for its the capacity of this interior workshop space to model and manage and kind of imagine a new kind of life for pedagogy and education, right? A new kind of design and set of interactions between the designer and the world outside, right? The kind of openness of this facade and the openness of the workspace. What we want to recognize here is that this building, the Bauhaus Dessau, designed, of course, by Walter Gropius and colleagues in the early 1920s, built with one of the first curtain walls. Just a few more pictures, images to give us a clear sense of that curtain wall, right? Built with one of the first hung curtain walls that was a very thin set of single pane glass. Any of you involved in the building sciences or thermal engineering, right, already are maybe kind of shuddering at the thought of this northern German building with such a kind of thin and delicate set of facade glass. This uninsulated single pane of glass and iron spandrels that surrounded three sides of the building enclosed this remarkably open interior. Sorry, right, I want to be on this image that gives us a little more of the flavor of it. So effective in producing a sense of openness and a space for engagement, this design and construction approach exhibited remarkably poor thermal conditions, right? So part of the point that I'm trying to sort of tease out here is that the Bauhaus Dessau, again, represents a kind of moment of important innovation and elaboration of a set of architectural ideas, of modern architectural ideas that we're all quite familiar with. But it does so according to a sort of profound reliance on fossil fuels, right? And we can trace, again, with various levels of sort of care and elaboration, we can trace the reliance on coal back to the intensity of coal use during World War I in the German context, right? A kind of moment, and this is a pattern that repeats, a moment when this kind of intensity of extraction of energy resources for wartime use then produced a surplus. And post-war, in this case, post-World War I, a set of questions emerged of how to best take advantage of that surplus, right? And which is to say there was a kind of sense, as Gropius and his colleagues were designing this building, that energy was abundant, that there was kind of, more and more that would be made available and readily available. So one might as well design a building that in fact used as much of that energy as possible, right? That had no sort of boundaries or barriers relative to its energy metabolism. And this actually became quite complicated in the case of the Bauhaus, in part because of that thin curtain wall, right? And this image is just to sort of help us see the importance of the radiator, even kind of in the middle of the stairwell, right, to keep things heated because of that those poor insulative qualities. In the first 35 years of the building's operation, the heating system underwent 7 different sort of renovations and retrofits, right, from different types of coal to more intensive boilers. Eventually, much later in the 80s, turning to steam-based district heat system. But a recognition that one of the stories of the Bauhaus, the story that we don't often tell, is a story of a kind of ongoing attempt to heat the building and keep it running smoothly, that again involved blowouts and explosions and piles of coal sitting next to the workshop wing for many years in a row in order to sort of feed into those boilers. Now, in the present condition, in 2021, the Bauhaus is struggling to sort of maintain viability, right? It's of course a heritage building, an important building to our architectural histories, and indeed to the history of Germany and to global culture. But it also is too expensive in terms of carbon to heat to a sort of livable condition, right? So in fact, there's been a set of competitions and kind of exercises to reimagine the possibilities for the Bauhaus. One of them I point to here, which involves inserting these sort of plexiglass vitrines into the interior. I should just note this is just one component of a very complex set of programs proposed by June 14th, Maya Grobruch and Chermayeff to elaborate on this transformation. But this notion that the requirements of the building have changed, right? in part because our transformation to the way that we live in interiors, and in part because of the changing social costs of carbon that initially seemed to be quite low when more and more coal was piled into the Bauhaus boilers, and now we recognize much higher costs in that carbon profligacy, hydrocarbon fuel profligacy, right? So we have to reimagine, right? We have to begin to reimagine forms of practice, forms of inhabitation, and in this extreme case where the heritage value of this building is, so much in the foreground, this is one sort of proposal that has suggested a way to manage those complications. Okay, so, again, part of what I'm suggesting and starting to play out is that, in fact, when we begin to think about buildings as energetic objects, energetic systems, devices for climatic adaptability, we begin to sort of open up a broad counter-history and set of questions and interests about the discussions of architecture over the post-war period, and we'll just see a few sort of instances of that. And by objects, by buildings as energetic systems, that's the phrase I was looking for, forgive me. By thinking about buildings as energetic systems, we're attentive to their thermal mass, their embodied energy. We're attentive, of course, to the conditions of insulation and the conditions of glazing. We're attentive to the kind of transformations that buildings undergo over time and the ways that they change and operate in different ways. We're attentive to many different forms of practice, both in building and in occupation, that transform the way that we inhabit these spaces and think about these buildings, right? And so I've pulled just a handful of a large number of buildings in the Australian context that from the mid-70s, from the kind of one of the solar booms, not only in Australia, but worldwide. I like to think of this as the third solar age, and we're now in the sixth, as far as I can tell. A moment when we're kind of reimagining building forms and shape and reimagining the kind of priorities of a building to focus on its energetic condition, right? And also really reimagining how we interact with it, right? And we're beginning to kind of lean towards the final concept that I want to play out for us this evening, which is that of thermal practices, right? And think about the ways that we live and the ways that we operate and engage with buildings as themselves being parts of our daily lives, parts of our sort of management of this energetic system, these facades and conditions between the conditions of the climate and the global exterior, right? The kind of global climatic system, and then the conditions of the climate and the thermal interior. This is a well-known house by Steve Baer, the engineer that was also essential to a number of the dome houses from that period of the 70s. And some of you may know this house, but this is basically a house with a wall kind of outlining the wall here. I don't know if you can see my little cursor that opens up during the day and brings the sun in to these 10-gallon drums that are full of water, right, absorbing heat during the day. And then at night, you sort of crank that wall up, right? You can kind of see the tie line here. You can see them here. You crank this wall up to form something of a seal, right, an insulative condition, so that the heat that was collected in those drums overnight is displayed into the interior. Sorry, radiated into the interior. So this broad concept of thermal practice has its own sort of history and context, right? And helps us to, again, to kind of reimagine not only the ways that we live in spaces, but the ways that we design these liminal conditions and these facades and these interfaces and mediating devices and climatic adaptive systems between the world that we have inside and the climate on the exterior. I want to just give us one more set of examples to think through some of these issues. In this case, looking briefly at Brazil in the 1940s and 50s, at a moment when Brazil was kind of, as a country, speaking very broadly, struggling to enter into a certain type of industrialized modernity, where they had, in fact, for various historical reasons, access to a lot of concrete, in fact, a lot of asbestos, a certain amount of steel, but not a lot of the kind of energy systems that could power air conditioners and other sorts of systems that were beginning to emerge in the American and to some extent European context. That would come later with the discovery of oil off of the coast of Brazil that was then elaborated up to the present. But in this early moment, there was an attempt to use these dramatic flexible devices, right? Flexible facade devices, to think about the complex relationship between the facade as mediating system, the global climate outside, right, although thought of on very different terms in the way we think about it today, and the kind of thermal conditions of the interior, right? So an image such as this, in which we see the section of this building, and I know a lot of you are architects, but for those of you who might not be familiar with this sort of drawing, I'll help you walk through it for a second. This sort of opening up of the sash down below, right? This kind of this facade system. So this facade section here is the facade that we're seeing on this building over here. And we're seeing a sort of cutaway that allows us to understand the different sorts of behaviors and choreographies and practices that can bring this spatial interior into a different thermal condition as the seasons change, as the sun changes during the day, right? So you can kind of imagine the choreography. You imagine maybe opening the sash in the morning to let some fresh air in. You're sort of protected by the fixed vanes in the hottest part of the day at noon. Maybe depending on the temperature outside or the time of year, you might lower that sunscreen for when the sun's coming towards it at around 6 p.m., right? A whole set of dynamic systems that define the thermal practice of inhabitation, right? And that are determined through a complex set of interrelations of scientific forms of knowledge, of research practices, right? Of methodological developments in the kind of architectural and scientific fields that encouraged and elaborated on these different forms of scientific knowledge. And sorry about that. I hope everybody's hearing me okay and everything. I'm sure you'll let me know. So different elaborations on these scientific forms of knowledge and how to integrate them, right, with the kind of formal and material and programmatic and other sorts of concerns more familiar to the architectural project. So, when we start to think about this question of thermal practice, when we start to think about this question of the thermal interior, I think what we're starting to recognize, right, is that some of these spaces that are managed by a relationship to the outside, right? Some of these spaces for which the facade becomes a negotiating system, a mediating system, right? That kind of allows for the thermal interior, the space of habitation, the space of work to be changed and adjusted according to seasonal and daily patterns in relationship to the kind of complexities and of course, in today's age, even more complex and unknowable conditions of the climate outside, right? So really trying to establish this relationship, right? To establish a relationship on the one hand between, again, the climate outside and the thermal conditions on the interior, mediated by the facade. We're seeing here a set of movable panels, right, that can kind of be moved back and forth and crosshatched to allow for more shading, to bring in different elements of daylight. Mediated by the facade, a set of relationships that's also not only between the climate and the thermal interior, right, but that's between a sort of sense of culture and an elaboration of a certain type of life inside, a set of practices, a set of ways of being, and a sort of set of conditions and forms of knowledge about life outside, again, right, about the sort of changing conditions of nature. So part of what we're recognizing, or what I'm trying to emphasize, is that the ways in which we begin to sort of provide filters, right? The ways in which we begin to sort of mediate between these foundational and sort of epical conditions of the global climate and let it resonate across the interior, those sorts of practices, on the one hand, the design practices that determine those facades, right? And on the other hand, the kind of life practices, the daily forms of existence, the patterns, the habits, right? Now, some of you might, for example, wake up in the morning and sit in one room to take in the summer sun while you're drinking your coffee, or I guess winter sun, fall sun down there. And then maybe when you come home from work in the evening, you spend some time in a different room that's been heated by the day, or maybe like many of us today, air conditioning has just taken over, right? And so this is again getting to the sort of heart of the matter, right? That as we begin to imagine the world as the construct of a set of built environments that encourage certain types of thermal practice, right? We recognize that we're faced with a set of very complex historical trajectories, right? The kind of emergence of flowering and elaboration of these types of shaded facades that allowed for different types of life to go on inside. And then there's sort of consolidation, or there's sort of shutting down again, right, through this kind of ideological closure about a certain type of interaction with the facade, a kind of relationality of the architectural project that's also a sort of energetic elaboration, right? And as we see in this image on the right, this building that we saw a bit ago of these gentlemen opening and closing, well, opening, looks like they're opening, the shade, right? And after 1970, about 1978, after the second oil crisis began to dissipate, that careful facade system was removed and replaced with these in-window air conditioning units. The same thing happened in this building here. Again, a number of different, very elaborate facade mechanisms to allow for different conditions to be manipulated and arranged such that the interior would be adjusted according to the conditions of the climate. That entire shading system has just been stripped away, and this kind of strange looking sort of eave condition is now used as a support system for air conditioners, for chillers, right? So these are the kind of interiors that also determine our lives today, right? These kind of facade systems become just sealed conditions, sealed enclosed membranes to maintain the hybridity and maintain a certain amount of consistency across these interior systems, right? And so we begin to recognize that the life of the 20th century, that this question of concealment, right? These kind of questions of modes of concealment that I started with when talking about petroculture and talking about the kind of different strands of intellectual and emotional and climatic life that we are beginning to reimagine. And you know, you recall that when we were having that discussion not too long ago, this question of petroculture was elaborating on the kind of visibility and invisibility of these systems. And what we begin to recognize is that part of the project of architecture, right, has been to hide these systems, quite literally in the drop ceiling, as we're seeing here in the Elements exhibition organized by Rem Koolhaas in the 2015 Venice Biennale, but that's evident in many other contexts, right? That's kind of the last part of the building that gets produced that helps us to kind of realize and see in different contexts the elaboration of these ventilation systems. They're revealing and they're hiding in different ways. Okay, so thinking about then these conditions of thermal practice, right? Thinking about these different derivations and different ways that our interiors are informed, I want to conclude with a few, I hope, kind of central thoughts, right? That allow us to rethink the conditions, not only of our present systems, but also to allow us to rethink the future, which is to really focus on considering how we live in spaces, right? How the thermal dynamics and social dynamics are co-created by the built environments that we produce, co-created, that is, in a number of different ways, co-created by the global climate and the forms of practice that are adjusting it and mediating it, right? Co-created as well by the habits and practices of the individuals living in the interior and the sorts of mechanical and electrical and other sorts of systems that their bodies or their activities necessarily sort of invoke and reproduce. That these thermal practices have come to define our contemporary condition and perhaps our possible future. I'm gonna sort of dive into a few other trajectories in order to close up, to help us to put this in a broader context. But I think in part to help us imagine that this broad question around thermal practice, around petroculture, around kind of rethinking the dynamics and parameters of our contemporary designed life have many different elements and activities that can be rethought. So we can also think, in addition to a kind of thermal practice, we can begin to elevate this question of retrofit practice, right? And of course, the Pritzker Prize being awarded to Lacaton and Vassal, an image that we're seeing here. And I know recently, having visited, maybe still ongoing, sort of residency remotely at Sydney Uni, Lacaton and Vassal beginning to really amplify the exposure of these sorts of practices. To think about buildings as living systems, as energetic systems, as thermal objects that can be manipulated and reformed and reimagined over time, right? I mean, these are some of the more well-known examples, but we have other sorts of quotidian examples, right? Taking us back to Brazil, where in one case, rather than just installing, sticking air conditioners in every window, a sort of very thoughtful and community-focused set of renovation practices that emerged in the context of the Pedro Gullo housing block, a set of narratives I'd be happy to elaborate on. So thermal practice, retrofit practice, right? And then I think one place where I want to start to end on, and that kind of shifts the discussion, but not really, and that's the kind of point that I want to try to be really careful about, right, is something I want to call customary practice, right, which is to recognize that one of the profound kind of aspects of architectural modernization in this context, in the context of reimagining our ways of life, in the context of thinking of buildings as energetic systems, right? In the context of understanding the importance of buildings as sort of devices of climatic adaptability, right? One of the new ways that we think about this sort of intervention of modernity in architecture was its very explicit and intentional delegitimization of so-called pre-modern practices, right? Which is to say, part of the project of modernism was to say that that which came before is no longer relevant, right? This is we are progressing into the future. We are kind of moving past the past, right? And this is part of the international style and a whole set of historiographic and architectural interventions in this period. And part of what we're recognizing today, and I think in potent ways in the contexts I'm familiar with, especially in the Euro-American context, and I'm sure in many ways that I'm less versed in Australasia, part of what we're starting to do today is look back to some of those customary practices, those so-called traditional practices or vernacular practices, not only understanding them on their own terms as technical systems, right, but also understanding how they can be hybridized and reimagined as technologies sort of reproduced for the future in different ways. Beginning to really understand that not only do these technologies allow us to kind of reimagine and reposition ourselves as designers and kind of thinkers of the built environment in this context, but also that much of the kind of epistemological frameworks and conditions of knowledge production embedded in this customary knowledge, right, is very fruitful, is very hopeful as we kind of imagine life moving through the disruptions that are already happening and are, of course, only going to get more dramatic as we experience the increasing disruptions, the increasing instability of our climate system. So with all of that in mind, I want to close with a set of sort of grandiose interpretations, right? Because one of the other kind of issues that I tried to start with was the crisis that this has introduced, the crisis of our interiors and our kind of thermal conditions relative to the COVID pandemic. And, I know that the conditions have been remarkably different in the Australian context, but nonetheless, what we see is a kind of increasing charge of our built interiors, as they're now not only spaces where air conditioning happens, where thermal conditions are negotiated. These are also spaces, of course, where the virus is negotiated, and its aerosol airborne condition becomes a primary factor. And many of you may know that one of the main spaces for this discourse in the Euro-American context has been around repopulating school buildings, right, and kind of how to go back to school. And one of the imperatives there was to kind of turn up the air conditioning, right, was to turn up the ventilation system, was to increase, and in fact, compromise the prospects of one public health crisis, which is that of climate change and carbon emissions, right, in order to hopefully mitigate and improve another public health crisis, which is that of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So by turning up ventilation, you were able to move the air around and hopefully mitigate some of that viral spread. And this has even had this is an article from, I think, just 2 or 3 days ago on ABC News. In the Australian context, this is especially played out relative to the hotels, the quarantine hotels that are being used, right, and how the virus is nonetheless spreading around them through the ventilation systems, and a sort of pitch for a new set of standards. So I want to sort of close here just to sort of emphasize that when we think about our kind of practices that are thinking about them being co-produced by the designs that we make and the buildings that we live in, co-produced both by the sort of system of design production that has its regulatory apparatus, that has its kind of structural conditions, and that certainly has the agency of the designer on the one side, and also produced by sort of forms of living and forms of occupation and forms of habitation on another. We're not only imagining transformations to those thermal conditions, but also sort of opening up, quite literally trying to open a window, metaphorically and materially, to allow air to circulate, to allow those conditions to be more porous and interactive, and also to sort of open that window, right, to kind of reimagine how we can have some openings into other possible climatic and built environment futures. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that fabulous lecture, concluding in how we might open up our windows again to other future opportunities, rethinking our thermal practices, which I've noticed we have a couple of questions. In fact, two of them I would say are interrelated. We have that question that I think is always the impossible one to ask. You know, what can we do, asks John Neve, to get the future architecture that we so desperately need to alleviate the dangers of a rapidly warming planet, and what are the major impediments to this? And I wonder even whether John will allow me to expand on this question, or we'll expand it, maybe rather frame it from the point of view of our pedagogies. You know, you're speaking here to us at the Melbourne School of Design. Do we have opportunities here in terms of what we're teaching our students and how? It especially occurs to me in, you know, your work as a historian that this focusing on the environmental humanities and, you know, the various methodologies that you described in opening suggests that maybe we need curricular change of a quite radical kind, not only in our history classes, but maybe also in the way we're teaching technology. So I'm wondering whether you might speak to pedagogy first, and there
Sure.
might be a broader answer to the challenging question that John Neve has asked as well. Yeah.
Great. No, I think that's a great way to frame it, and can try to cover some of those bases. I mean, you know, I think part of what I'm trying to produce, not, you know, in my own research, in the kind of research that I've been cultivating through Current and through e-flux and, you know, other sorts of sort of discursive arenas, really trying to, you know, to kind of map and model a new, changing conception of architecture, right? That recognizes it as a kind of flexible system of adaptation to climate, to energy systems, to all sorts of changing environments that we live in. You know, which is to say that architecture, I think in a pretty profound way, is in a real place of transition, right? And the models and you know, the kind of star system that many of us were sort of educated in, of the, you know, whether it's the Le Corbusiers or the Zaha Hadids, and, you know, nothing against any of those brilliant figures, but the notion that we're here to emulate the kind of design excellence and talent of a given individual, to, you know, work hard to do our best to kind of reach those goals. You know, those sorts of aspirations seem less potent, right, than they might have 10, 20 years ago. And I don't know, some would have argued probably the same thing 20 years ago, but nonetheless, you know, we begin to kind of reimagine what the kind of principles and parameters of the field are. And I think that the schools is where that imagination and where the sort of new principles and new practices and techniques can really begin to emerge, right? And so how do we think about retrofit and reuse as a profound theme of architectural practice? How do we see it as a space of creativity? You know, again, we have there's another kind of star system there with the Pritzker Prize going to Lacaton and Vassal, perhaps, but nonetheless, the technologies, the design approaches, the knowledge about embodied energy and material systems, right? I mean, a very different set of conceptual and technical tools that can encourage architects, help architects to kind of take on the so-called retro-first opportunities, right? The kind of, you know, in any given environment, always trying to sort of use the existing building stock. And, you know, that's a pretty profound change, right? To how we operate. I mean, not only, you know, I mean, I was giving a, you know, sort of similar presentation in a studio course at, let's just say, an Ivy League institution with a very well-known studio leader, and having the same sort of discussion. And he said, well, but I really like making ground up buildings, right? It's fun. That's what I live for. And, you know, I respect that. I mean, you know, an accomplished architect of a certain generation, how could you imagine doing anything else? That's the prize, is to get those commissions, right? But I think that in our students, you know, we're cultivating other desires, we're cultivating other ambitions that are less about the kind of jewel box, you know, often, frankly, the sort of quite ethically compromised jewel box for the rich people, you know, kind of some, you know, art collector's beautiful house 2 hours out of the city. Not that there aren't other great projects in the world, but, you know, pushing against that sort of model and saying, you know, what about designing with communities, right? What about understanding how interventions can not only elaborate on, improve the conditions of life in a given region, in a given neighborhood, in a given building, how they can change the thermal environment and elaborate on different energy systems. how they can even, sort of provide a different sense of place or sense of identity to a given community that can help to elevate, self-respect and social values and other, a completely different set of kind of issues being put on the table, right? And I even struggle to articulate this myself, and there's others who do this much better than I, right? But, I think we're all kind of trying to find ways into this new world that we believe in and that we see coming towards us, but are still trying to figure out how to operate relative to, right? Certainly one aspect of that world is that it no longer has hydrocarbon fuels, right? And I mean, again, this is kind of my zone of it. I mean, if, we have a number of different discussions on the table, but how to begin to really think about producing a built environment that isn't reliant on petrochemicals. I mean, to paraphrase whoever Frederick Jameson was paraphrasing, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of air conditioning, right, in many environments. And certainly on the US East Coast, and I'm sure, in my experience of the Australian East Coast as well in the summer, air conditioning is maybe not everywhere, but certainly desired, right? And so, how we begin to reimagine the conditions of comfort that we expect in a building, the kind of thermal environments that we anticipate walking into, how we begin to train architects to think about comfort and those conditions of climatic management, again, as a space for creative elaboration, as a space for rethinking expectations, as a space for affect, as a space for the production of a kind of novel experience, right? Is there a kind of parametrics of the thermal environment, right? Is there a kind of the cultural opening that can help us to really imagine how to not only build differently, right, but value different experiences, right? And so, one of the things that we can do in schools, and this is in classrooms, in this kind of integrated model that many schools are increasingly following, of bringing histories and technologies and studio courses together, but also sort of building out the sort of public apparatus of the university and the lecture series, the exhibition series. So many opportunities, right, to kind of put different issues on the table to kind of help us think through the challenges that we face in different ways. So I think that, I mean, I don't know if this is sort of disappointing in some ways, but I think that a lot of what I'm trying to do in my own pedagogy, in my own history teaching, but also in the interactions I have with studio courses, which is a good chunk of my professional life, is to encourage a sort of transitional approach, right? And to kind of recognize that, we want to take a few steps towards thinking about architecture in different ways, towards thinking about transformations to the built environment that are not going to be, we're all going to live without carbon tomorrow, right? I mean, that are not going to be these sort of pie in the sky. I mean, not that, I mean, if you can figure that out, good on you, but rather are going to be thinking about, what are the adjustments that one can make to regulations, to policies, to design methods, to design softwares, to, structural reliance on structural steel, all the kind of bits and pieces that start to kind of aggregate towards the built environment that is so carbon dependent, right? I think one of the things that I've drawn on from the petroculture research and the kind of broader environmental humanities discourse is really, a profound recognition of how sort of built in, right, hydrocarbon fuels are to our ways of life, right? I mean, not only in the kind of plastics we use, and of course the energy systems that heat and cool our buildings, but it's hard to imagine doing anything without using oil, right, or without kind of drawing on petroleum resources. There's caveats and exceptions, but our lives are so soaked in petroleum, right? And so trying to find a way out of that, right? We're not just going to kind of wake up one day and like, okay, no more, right? I mean, we have to adjust our structural conditions. We have to advocate for policy changes. We have to advocate for new codes and regulations. So I think, one of the things we want to bring to our students is a kind of recognition and appreciation of this transitional moment, right? And of the kind of experience of these complex transformations that we don't always know where they're going to go, right? And that we're not in the same kind of realm that we've been before.
There's and I think relevant to this and an interesting moment to reflect upon in the series of images that you showed us was the image of the sort of carefully worked out mechanical system of sun shading, that's manually operated. And then at a certain point, is replaced entirely by air conditioners. And so embedded just in this shift, which presumably happens quite quickly in a way, on the other hand. So there's a quick shift from that manual operation and maintenance, no doubt, required into a fully enclosed system that's air conditioned. There's a wealth to be said around questions of thermal practice, I think. If we can swap so quickly into that air-conditioned sealed environment, how come it's so hard to kind of reconsider other ways of managing through discrete acts of maintenance, through humble acts of care, through just kind of getting by and coping our interior environments in ways that aren't dependent on these energy-hungry systems?
Yeah, no, it's a great set of questions. I mean, I think that, I think one of the things we really struggle with collectively is a sort of reliance on a sense of comfort, right? One of the realities of the sort of petrochemical century, right, is that our building stock, and it's uneven around the world, right? But the kind of object of focus for not only kind of architects, but the kind of building industry, right? And the kind of apparatus of ASHRAE, thermal comfort regulations and building codes and energy policies and, all sorts of different kind of inputs, that all in a way kind of come together in this kind of discrete interior, right? That we live in, that we work in, that we go to school in. That so many of these different factors are at play, and to really try to understand that part of the project there was to produce a sort of normative space, right? If not quite a universal space, the project of so much of our sort of larger scale thermal guidelines for buildings and even material guidelines for buildings, have to do with sort of producing a certain kind of regulated, anticipated, understood interior condition, right? So that we could walk into an airport or a building in Melbourne and in Hong Kong and in Shanghai and Berlin and New York and Mexico City, and wear the same clothes, basically, right? I mean, be the same person, right? In these kind of dramatically different places. And that sort of emphasis on a norm, has been a kind of engine for architectural elaboration, right? Which is to say that all of the debates of modernism and postmodernism and parametricism and, neo-postmodernism, et cetera, to some extent, for the most part, are on the foundation of air conditioning, right? I mean, all of those elaborations and whether you're going to do a thing over here or do a thing over here, right? I mean, that's all kind of assuming that the engineers are just going to come in and figure it out and make it livable, right? And that's no longer something we can assume. So we're really kind of, down to the basics in some ways, insofar as we're really trying to, I think as you put it, think about practices of care, practices of maintenance, these sort of coping strategies that will allow us to get through this sort of moment of transition when, I mean, speaking somewhat personally, sort of raised to assume that, the good life was in an air-conditioned space. The good, and I'm, coming from a very privileged kind of northern, white guy position. Many other cultures are also raised to, aspire to a sense of comfort, aspire to a kind of normative condition because it's healthy, because it's one can be productive, because one can be mobile, right, and enter into a certain kind of echelon of social behaviors, and we're trying to think about how do we reimagine those aspirations, right? And how does architecture become a space where we negotiate that kind of thermal budget, right? And kind of allow for some people to have those opportunities, not me, frankly, right? Like I don't need air conditioning in general, right? I mean, many other people do, and many, whether for health reasons or to be more productive, or, if I don't write another article about climate and architecture in a year because I'm too hot in August, or, what is the case may be, we'll be okay, right? But there's others, if we can kind of transfer our thermal wealth, right? And of course, that's very abstract and quite difficult to do on practical terms. But how do we begin to imagine, in effect, buildings as the kind of medium for that transfer, right? For kind of producing different kinds of livability in different spaces, that take into account privilege, that take into account public health and the need for those, sealed normative, hospitals, of course, need to be air conditioned. Archives to some extent need to be air conditioned. Many other spaces don't.
I wonder whether this, I don't think it's exactly what you mean by customary practices, but I think there's this sense of drawing on, knowledges from elsewhere, whether it's vernacular, whether it's indigenous knowledges, but also extending an architectural knowledge outwards that speaks to the different ways in which, we must manage our environments. So, it's not as though you move into a house and you can be fully independent of it and it's just going to look after you like some kind of smart home, but you have to sort of, interact with it. You've got this organism and environment relationship, and if you interact with it in the best way, then you don't need to switch on your air conditioner because you've closed all your blinds or awnings in the morning when it's hot, or, the fact that perhaps we've lost the knowledge to simply look after our thermal environments in an everyday way of, a practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I actually had a really interesting experience this, pandemic year teaching a course that I teach on the history and theory of architecture and climate to students who are studying environmental building design technologies, right? And normally we have this discussion, we're all in the classroom, and they're all kind of in their dorms, or, we're all in Philadelphia. I asked them to sort of map out their day relative to their thermal practices. When do you open the window, or maybe you turn on the heater, or you turn on the air conditioner, or you maybe sit by a fire, right? But what was really interesting this year was that because those students were now in China and Mexico City and Mumbai and all over the world, and many of them in some form of ancestral home, right? I mean, or their parents' home, or in a number of cases, parents and grandparents, much more aware than in previous years of those kind of patterns and how they've been passed down. And, oh, my grandfather sits, on this chair in the morning and this chair at night. And, of course, some of that is not thermal, but, there's other inputs, but just a recognition of how that tacit knowledge has not so much been lost, but has just been sort of flooded, kind of overwhelmed, right, by air conditioning, right, by just kind of pressing buttons and assuming that environments will be amenable to our, will take care of us, right, rather than we take care of them. And so I think that kind of, and it's in part to say that it's not that far back, right? I mean, we're not talking about kind of, millennia ago, right? I mean, we're talking about, even in architecture, right? I mean, the architectural reliance on air conditioning, 50s, 60s, right? I mean, half a century at most. And, really a wealth of strategies, a wealth of practices, not only in the Australian outback, right, but in the towns and cities, right? I mean, in more dense places, and whether it's about thick walls and small window openings, or, or it's about that sort of elaborate solar and social kind of machinery and mechanics, right? But a whole wealth of practices and activities that are about activating oneself in relationship to their thermal surround. I think we have to. Go ahead.
It links to a nice question that I know has come up too from someone called Jeff, who's interested, and I'm really interested in hearing about this too. You mentioned in passing this idea of, we're now in the sixth solar age, and I think I think there are some people here in the audience really keen to hear about this sort of six solar ages that you're articulating.
Yeah, this is actually something I play out in that same course, which is, again, trying to, insofar as part of the project here, the kind of longer term project, is to really begin to reimagine a history of architecture where the energetic conditions of the building are primary rather than, kind of tense, right? Or kind of rather than way back in line. And one of them is, to begin to kind of reimagine periodicity, right? And kind of, so modernism is this, huge moment in our field, and it's very vague, and people interpret it in different ways, and it started here and it ended there. We don't necessarily need to get into those details, but we do note that modern architecture sort of emerged with coal, and that if we want to say that it kind of ended-ish, follow Charles Jenks, kind of early 70s postmodernism, it ended with an oil crisis, right? I mean, it kind of started to lose its legs when some of that reliance on fossil fuels, it was briefly questioned. Of course, then it just kind of got reinvigorated around oil. But so what I do is I look at, in this course, I look at what I call the first solar age, which is the kind of teens and 20s, the early Frank Lloyd Wright and Gropius and Korb and kind of, familiar kind of early modernists that were playing with the sun, right? That were kind of seeing the sun as an important input. I'm going to do this super quickly instead of in the kind of hour and a half lecture that it usually comes through, but that's kind of the first solar age. The second one is in the 1940s, and my first book, called A House in the Sun, is focused on how space heating for solar energy was a really important part of the post-war American kind of expansion of modernism, mostly in housing, across the Northeast, and eventually all the way over to California in the Southwest. But a sort of second solar age that was much more spatially attuned, that was really thinking about volumes as thermal volumes, right? That was really attentive to radiation and insulation, a bit more kind of technologically astute, still not photovoltaics, right? And then in the 60s, when, and in effect, in the kind of, this is where Rayner Banham comes in, and the whole kind of world of the architectural apparatus and kind of environmental mechanisms, some of which were solar focused, becomes a third solar age. And, of course, this is to some extent jokingly modeled off of Banham's theory and design in the first machine age too. So he has to play a kind of subtle role through all of this as well. 70s is pretty obvious, right? 70s is this kind of flowering of solar energy. And, again, I should note, Australia, I mean, there's a few dissertations in progress now, but Australia, New Zealand as the kind of core really of a lot of that experimental activity. Steve Zolokai, who I think just recently retired from University of Queensland, kind of one of the major progenitors of that knowledge and kind of expansion of that knowledge. Dick De Beer still, I think, at Sydney Uni, or maybe he's at UTS. Sorry, I get a little lost in some of the details, but it's just to say that Sydney and Queensland and Melbourne in different ways have been centers for this kind of climatic and solar analysis since the 50s, right? The kind of experimental labs run by Hank Cohen at the University of Sydney were really one of the first to articulate a kind of environmental science of building, right? I mean, so Australia is really at the core of a lot of this knowledge. And that really flowered in the 70s, right? With the experimental solar houses and with some of them taking on a kind of more larger scale than they did in the kind of Pacific, in the American sort of Pacific coast. But that, in effect was shut down. And the story I ran across really quickly, right, of Jimmy Carter putting solar panels on the White House and then Ronald Reagan taking them off, right? I mean, this is postmodernism, right? I mean, this is when we don't want that anymore. But returned by the late 80s. And that was in part because of the kind of students of some of those 70s architects, in part because of ongoing resource strains around the world. And in part because photovoltaics had kind of attained a certain amount of affordability and kind of changed that discussion quite a bit. So that's the fifth in the late 80s. And then the kind of sixth, optimistically is up to the present, is the kind of 2005-ish to the present, a date that I choose just because of a handful of kind of innovations in photovoltaic efficiencies. But it's to say that, I think we're at the beginning, early stages of, a world that will be determined by solar energy use. And again, Australia will be at the heart of that. I mean, as much as we can all be verklempt perhaps about the energy policies that continue to condition the political voices of the Australian discourse, Australia's future is solar, right? I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. And
well,
I
we
think
just
that
have to convince some of our politicians not to imagine that gas is still the answer. That would be one thing. Right. Architects have got big jobs to do here.
Well, exactly. But I think that's exactly the point, right? How to advocate, how to articulate, how to draw those histories, how to draw those buildings, how to imagine those kind of conditions of economic value, and not necessarily put it on the terms of growth, but viability of Australia in this case. But one could say the same about California and parts of the American Southwest and the Indian subcontinent. And I mean, I'm focusing on Australia because that's where we are. But the future of the world is renewable energy. The future of, I think Australia's kind of potential for solar elaboration is amazing, right? And so, that's part of what I think this transition is about, right? I mean, how do we get the students and the architects and others to take that on as a design imperative, but I think as we're sort of jokingly suggesting, as a position of advocacy, right? As a position of activism, and insisting that, part of what architects learn is not only knowledge that's appropriate for the beautification of the urban environment, right, but also for knowledge that helps us to understand buildings as energetic systems, right, and the consequences of overdevelopment and the consequences of too much emissions, et cetera, right? I mean, we are at the heart of those discourses and can take those positions seriously.
We have profound and entangled systems at work, as you've described, and I'm even thinking of a cinema advertisement I saw recently when I was at the cinema with my kids, BHP advertising, how much they support renewable energy, but of course we can't put up our wind power unless we've got the copper, that, runs the wiring and whatnot, and therefore we need to continue to extract. So we have also, even renewable energies provide these complexities, as you've spoken to the, the violence of some modes of extraction, the emergence of what we can describe as extractivism as a domain of sort of discourse and knowledge. So it's never so easy to kind of get ourselves out of the troubles, so to speak.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think this is my anxiety around the kind of electric car, right? And the lithium batteries and the, already the political unrest in Bolivia, et cetera. I mean, one can sort of, Thea Rio Francos has written an amazing book on this kind of history and future, but that's a kind of a good example, right? Because, and this is maybe, the difference that I would think is essential to the way architects and others are thinking about this, which is the difference between transition and transformation. Right. And I say this in part, I'm kind of bleeding into a broader discourse around the so-called just transition and energy transitions. And there's a whole kind of world of a kind of UN sustainable development goal produced discourse of the just transition. So a transition means that we're now, instead of relying on extracting petroleum from the Niger Delta, we're relying on extracting lithium from Bolivia to power our electric cars, whatever. I mean, maybe there's, not that it's equal, not that it's, it's not so simple. I'm drastically oversimplifying, but it's, it's the transition that says we're moving from one reliance to another, right? And if we look at the history of energy transitions over human history, we see that it's really about energy additions, right? And we didn't get rid of coal once petroleum came along, right? We didn't get rid of biomass once coal came along, et cetera. We just added, right? And so really what we're after is less of a kind of, additive, another addition, adding lithium batteries to our energy systems, but rather really imagining, what if we are really thinking about transforming our societies to be less car dependent, right? And transforming, rather than the driverless car, public transportation, right? And investing in other sorts of community resources so that people don't have to drive as far. I mean, again, things that architects and planners and people in our schools are expert in and excited about, right? That say, I mean, I think a lot about a sort of notion that Andrew Barry, the sociologist, developed, which is that technologies are often a way to sort of get out of politics, right? A kind of solutionism that says, we don't have to contest this, we don't have to talk this through. We'll just make the cars electric and problem solved, or we'll just put photovoltaic panels all over the roofs and, we're done, right? And of course, it's never even stated that simply, but it's to say that part of what's at stake here is finding ways to use technological and architectural sort of spatial devices to illuminate these conflicts, right? To illuminate these spaces for social contestation, to give voices to those who haven't been respected, listened to, heard, to allow for other sorts of discussions to happen, so that this transformation off of hydrocarbons is also a transformation towards a more ethical society, right? So it's not, again, a transition from one extractivism to another, but rather a real attempt to transform our aspirations, our social relations, our ways of interacting into a world that is less dependent upon those extractive resources, right? And over time, this is not tomorrow. And again, I think a lot. I do these sort of caveats because a lot of times I know I get these questions, and I'm sure some people are thinking, well, but what about this certain chemical that's necessary for the artificial heart that keeps my grandmother alive? Yes, there's exceptions, right? And we need to focus our energy on those exceptions. But again, most of us can adjust our lives to be less dependent upon the single car, single family house even, right? And how do we begin to map out that sort of collective transformation?
Well, these are perhaps good words to conclude with. Thank you so much for your generous time today, Daniel, and your fabulous lecture. It was really great to have you here with us at MSD at Home. And of course, this lecture is being recorded, which means it'll be available on our YouTube channel quite shortly. So I just want to say again, thank you for your time, and hope to sort of see you in another forum soon.
Absolutely. Now, thank you so much for the invitation. It was really a pleasure. And thanks to the questions, such a great set of questions. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Okay.
All right. Bye, Daniel.
Bye-bye.